Hello. So we have a little bit of a kerfuffle today. Santosh, our co-host, was supposed to be here with us, but there was a miscommunication and he thought it was going to be a Zoom recording, which it is not. We're doing this live. So he can't be here with us today. We were going to talk about the topic of meritocracy and the problems with objective measurement. And Santosh was going to help me with the objective measurement side of things, but I'll do my best to kind of carry it for both of us. We have enlisted our cameraman, Mingwei, into this conversation. So we've put a mic on him and occasionally we'll be asking him questions. So the way we've framed today's talk is that you, Douglas, read a book by Michael Sandel called The Tyranny of Merit.
Yep.
And Santosh and I read a book written by two AI researchers called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And these two books approach kind of this topic, and we're not even sure if they mesh or if they really, touch on the same field, but we're gonna try and make this work. But from my understanding, Michael Sandel really questions this ideal of meritocracy that it seems we all have today. Every country strives for meritocracy, and he finds huge problems with it from a moral point of view. The book that I read, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, really questions this notion of even if we knew what was best and what was great, it's pointless to even strive for it because the pathways to get there are very deceptive. And there's actually really no way to plan towards that. So I would say one of the books makes a moral argument, and then the book that I read makes an epistemological argument, an argument about what can we really know about reality and the situation. So we can approach this topic from many angles, but Mingwei, I was wondering, what would be the more interesting starting point for you?
Let's start with the epistemological.
Okay. All right. So what I found interesting about this book was that it's written by two AI researchers, and they started off by talking about this interesting program that they both designed called Pick Breeder, Pick for PIC.
Okay.
And it was this website that allowed people to take random images and then select which ones they like to evolve into more images through mutation. And then they could save whatever they liked, and other users could then pick that and evolve those images even more. And so it was a very random process of evolution. And over time, users found incredibly interesting images that they could create just through randomness. They could create aliens, cars, different things that they would save. What the AI researchers found over time was that if your goal was to create an alien, there was no way you could plan for it because the steps leading up to making an alien image were completely unlike what you would have expected. So this led them to actually ask a deeper question about all forms of searching. And in their field, artificial intelligence, a lot of it is about writing algorithms that can search better. So let's say people who try to program self-driving cars, they are trying to write algorithms that search for the most optimal parameters of braking speed, distance, whatever, for a car to self-drive. So most of the AI field actually is engaged in this kind of search for heuristics. And what they found is that this feature of reality, that you cannot actually know the pathways to greatness, was everywhere. They saw this everywhere. And then they started thinking about how much society is driven by objectives. We all want to send our kids to the best schools. We all want to get the best job. We're trying to hire people who will perform the best in our company. So there's always this notion of having an objective and then trying to plan for it. And what they are trying to say in this book is that it's pointless trying to do that because no matter what you do, you're gonna just run into these deceptive roadblocks. And what's great is that because they are AI researchers, they were able to write programs that tested their theories in the real world. So for instance, they would write a program for robots to learn how to walk through a maze. And the program that specifically had the objective of walking through the maze would fail 1 out of 30 times, right? Like will fail most of the time. Actually, 29 out of 30 times. Whereas the program that was just very random and just said, look, just look for the most interesting novelty, right? So what this program would start off doing was the robot would walk into a wall, and it's like, okay, that didn't work, let me try something new. Let's walk this way. Those programs succeeded 25 or 29 out of 30 times. So it was much more successful than the programs that aimed for an objective. So anyway, that's a rough thesis of the book.
Okay, so let me give my first thoughts. So I actually do see the merits of the argument because I do think that when you talk about, say, human creativity or the freedom to explore possibilities, obviously if you're looking for something that hasn't been considered before, you can't you can't rely on traditional heuristics or old rules and algorithms. You have to try something new. And I can imagine that, yes, if you rely or if you are too set in your ways, then you're always going to produce old solutions, right? And so there's definitely a lot of value to the argument that greatness has, the book is trying to deconstruct here. There needs to be a certain random game theory element to it, right? Yeah. And what I'm thinking of right now, me as a person listening to you, and I know, right, that I'm really, being your co-host, being the same person that reads the same kind of books as you do, I'm really very partial to your arguments. But I'm going to try to think of it from the perspective of a more ordinary layperson. And I can imagine the person using, say, because you talk about exams, right? And our kids going to schools, and we want our kids to get the best grades, etc., right? So they may look at our children, right? And they may say, well, okay, sure, I want my kid to be super explorative, super creative, imaginative for his art class. But when he's doing his English, his maths, and his science exams, there has to be some objective measure, doesn't it? There must be a right answer to a question. So that's one I'm trying to tease out to you. I mean, I think to some people, they're going to find the idea a little bit hard to grapple with, because to them, in the real world, there must be some right and wrong answers. So how would you respond to that? Do you think that there's a way to looking at certain dimensions or certain variables in a more objective manner, or can we actually even be much more explorative, even in say more rigid subjects, let's say science and maths?
So before I try and tackle the case of parents with kids in school, because I think that's such a high stakes and stressful kind of situation, like all Singapore parents have to deal with this. So let me first introduce a nuance into the book's argument. They're not trying to say that all objectives are pointless. So they're only trying to talk about ambitious objectives. So for simple objectives like you want to run a marathon, or even if you want to do well in a specific test, clearly, that those things you can kind of think through what the steps are needed to get you there. So they're more talking about just really ambitious objectives. So as an example, a tangible example from the world of technology, they're talking about, let's say you set out to invent computers. And we know how important and revolutionary computers have been. I mean, the whole IT revolution, you could say that is one of the greatest things humans have come up with. And the point they're trying to make is that you cannot set out, if no one knew what computers were, you cannot set out to okay, I'm now going to invent this amazing machine that can calculate and faster than any human can, because you can't actually know what the steps that lead to that are. And in actual fact, when we look at the history of the development of computers, a critical step to that was the invention of vacuum tubes. Now, vacuum tubes were these things that were invented by the earlier researchers in electricity, and they were kind of novelties. You know, you could suck the air out of a glass tube, seal it, and then run an electric charge through it. And it was a fun thing to do, and they could just explore different things. But those vacuum tubes turned out to be critical to the invention of computers, because they started being used as switches and amplifiers within computing systems. And it was only after that those switches and amplifiers evolved into becoming transistors and then silicon chips. So yeah, there's no way anyone could ever have thought that, oh, we need to invent or play around with vacuum tubes before we get to computers. So yeah, so they're talking about these, like, you know, ambitious goals, right? And okay, so now to bring it down to more personal level, and maybe this is something that everyone just has to test for themselves, like in their sort of circle of friends or their personal experience, whether this is true. But if someone sets out to be a successful business person, like from day one, they're 12 years old and they know that's what they want to be. The writers are trying to say that in most cases, you're not going to succeed, because it is impossible for you to know, like, what are going to be the steps that lead you there. And if you look at the biographies of most successful businessmen and their lives took so many strange turns. And, you know, like, it wasn't until like the last step where they, you know, discovered something interesting or whatever that, you know, gave them success. And they could never have predicted that when they were age 12. So their advice is that, you know, if you want to be successful in life or great, you can't really plan for it, and nothing can really guarantee that to you. But you have a much better shot at it if you pursue what is interesting to you. So as scary as it sounds for most parents, it's much better to encourage your children to pursue what they genuinely care about, what they find interesting, than to just study for an exam.
Yeah, I mean, as a parent myself, I definitely have 100% concurrence with that piece of advice, and I think a lot of it actually just stems from the idea that it goes back to, in some sense, tangentially speaking, to the whole system of meritocracy, right? Because in a system in a meritocratic system, we tend to look at everyone to some degree as a set of input or as a resource, and so we are constantly measuring their worth by the kind of achievements that they made. So if I had, if I have two kids and one kid is not performing so well academically and the other one is, then under this system, I'm supposed to morally judge that, you know, the kid who's achieving better in school is greater than the other one, right? And I can see that, like, it actually takes, you know, a parent who is able to look beyond that kind of objective measure to then be able to treasure and cherish the second child, even if that second child doesn't achieve as much meritocratic deeds as much as the first one. So I guess I can see, you know, like, where this is coming from. I guess my question is, like, with what this book is saying, right, and what the researchers are advocating, like, is there some kind of strategy? Is there some kind of alternative system that they're suggesting that people should switch to? Some kind of worldview, so that they can look beyond this kind of filters, this kind of objective filters.
Yeah. So the book is actually short on positive recommendations.
Right.
I mean, I think what it comes down to really is they use the word interestingness a lot.
Yeah.
And they also use metaphors. So they want people to think of themselves more as treasure hunters, and we go through life trying to collect stepping stones. So, you know, as an example from my own personal life, when I reflect back, I would say a lot of my decisions have been based on curiosity and passion. And I would say it is true when I was in my 20s, I wanted to be a great filmmaker. You know, like I idolized Steven Spielberg. I
Right.
wanted to make like big budget science fiction films.
Everyone wanted to be great.
Yeah. And as it turns out, my life has taken quite a lot of different turns. But my interest in filmmaking led me into a documentary project about this festival called Burning Man, which I've mentioned in the past. And I would say Burning Man has been one of the most interesting things I've ever come across in my life. Really, really interesting. I mean, it ignited so many things in me that looking back, I have no regrets that I didn't become Steven Spielberg. I mean, maybe there's a part of me that's like, of course, to be honest, like if I was given the opportunity to direct a big budget film, I would leap at it. But my sense of regret is not so huge because I feel I've been given a lot of other rewards along the way. So I really feel this book is like the anti-strategy. So when you ask what strategies do they have, it's really about there is no strategy. And there's a well-known philosophy of science book called Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. And Against Method was really like, even in the field of science, where you think it should follow a method, right? I mean, everyone talks about the scientific method. Even in the case of science, Paul Feyerabend was trying to argue that a better way to go is to have the rule, anything goes. Just explore anything. Because, in the past, like Isaac Newton, he was really interested in alchemy. And his interest in that led him into a lot of his scientific explorations.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to touch on that as well because you were talking about the whole scientific process, right? I mean, using that in scare quotes because I do think actually by now there's been this evolution in the philosophy of science, something that I do read from time to time, where there's a certain consensus now that there's no way one person can sit down and lay out the details. This is a scientific method, and if you follow this method, you will lead to great discoveries because science is actually a very convoluted, complex, dynamic process where all sorts of powers of logical processes, whether it's induction, deduction, all sorts of experimentation methods, everything just goes in and out of the scientific process. And you can't. I agree with you a lot on that statement, which is you just can't go in there expecting to make a discovery. You just got to go in there and get your feel for it, test and experiment as much as you can, and then hopefully something comes out of it. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, there's no logical process because that's the whole point about a science. A science means there's certain principles to take in place, but there's a lot of room for variability and ways to play with those principles. And I think I actually can relate this very much to. So my profession, obviously, as you know, is a health coach. And so for the viewers out there, just to share something, especially if you are someone who cares about your health, there's one thing you definitely take away from in terms of philosophy of being anti-objective measure, which is, whether it's the BMI, whether it's your absolute weight, whether it's the amount of push-ups you can do, whether it's the amount of squats you can do, these are all indicators that do not give you a reliable measure of your overall health and well-being. Yeah, there is no single indicator out there. So sometimes you see a lot in articles, right? Like, especially those maybe pop psychology or health based popular health magazines where they say, oh, if you can do 30 push-ups, you're considered in good health, or if you can do this, you can do that, then you're on a good road to aging well. Well, I mean, reality is a lot more complex than that. I mean, even looking at things like, say, cholesterol, even looking at things like BMI, there's always a lot more grayness to it. And although I am not principally against using objective measures in the sense that, okay, it's good to know your weight, it's good to know your blood sugar level, but the problem is always the interpretation of it. You got to take all these things together, all this data, and then you have to have this very complex composite picture of yourself. And that's the challenge. I think that, going along with that keyword greatness, right? So it's hard to measure great health because there's so many things you can look at. Someone could be physically very muscular and fit, but maybe he can't do very simple movements because he's in great pain, for example. So athletes actually professional athletes, they're not said to be in great health. They're actually sacrificing their health for performance. Again, where there's this paradox that, or oxymoron, I should say, where the athlete is being valued in a meritocratic society as, you know, this great epitome of health, but the truth is that this athlete is going to retire with a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and that's what happens to a lot of professional athletes. So, yeah, I think, you know, health is actually one great variable a person can look at and see that there's a lot more complexity than just a simple objective measure.
And also just to add, one thing they talk about in this book is that a lot of measurements are more useful as constraints rather than goals. So maybe in the context of health, these things are more like constraints. I mean, if you are over a certain weight or, you know, like you cross a certain boundary, then yeah, you'll be unhealthy, right? And it's more like you want to stay within certain constraints. But once you stay within those constraints, there's so many different creative options for you to pursue in order to, pursue sort of this idea of good health or to stumble across it.
Yeah, so I can give like a kind of a good example about constraints and stuff like that. So for example, let's take for women in particular, right? So there's always this peer pressure, right? And you can even say maybe this is kind of like a symptom of a meritocratic society where, you know, a woman is considered beautiful or healthy or fit if she's of a certain weight, of a certain height, certain body fat percentage and all that. But take a look at, say, women who are in weightlifting sports. I mean, they're huge, you know, because they have to compete in that sport, and they're strong, they're fit. They may not have any of those so-called diseases or illnesses that is supposed to be ascribed to women if they are overweight. They're perfectly fine, you know, and that is also kind of where the body positivity movement comes in, because you can look at different bodies and you can say that, hey, you know, there's really no one single measurement or one way of categorizing a body as being the epitome of fitness and health. They are really just, you know, a multitude of ways. Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing about what we are talking about, which is it's about human nature, isn't it? Which is human nature is pretty malleable, variable, and just like you talking about not being, you know, Steven Spielberg, the second Steven Spielberg, but we can find greatness in our own ways, right? And actually, along with that, just to dive into what you're talking about being a great filmmaker. I mean, the truth is you haven't been given opportunities. You don't live in America. You may not have access to Hollywood in particular, to great financial resources to be a great director. I mean, all these things that are just...
These are just excuses. I mean, the director of Squid Game did not use that as an excuse.
Right.
Yeah. But hey, just to bring our cameraman back in, how have you been finding the conversation so far? Is there anything that you are curious about listening to us?
Take your time.
There were a few thoughts on my mind, but I think I'll let you guys keep talking.
Okay. Just, you know, just keep checking with you every once in a while. Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
You know, I know it's a new role for you. I wanted to go back to the parents and kids and exams, right? I mean, so I think that's another area where it's useful to think of constraints instead. So clearly, if your kid is failing every exam and is going to be kicked out of school, that's not good, right? So you want to have a certain minimum standard. But on the other hand, it's, you know, if you're expecting your child to like score the highest on every exam, you know, then it becomes a goal. And really the value of exams and tests should be that when you take them and you don't score so well and you got some questions wrong, that tells you information. That tells you, oh, I didn't know that topic as well as I thought I did. And maybe that's something I want to, you know, like spend more time on, right? I mean, that's where the value of tests comes in.
Yep.
And you know, in Singapore, I think there was a case a couple of years ago where a boy committed suicide, you know, and the mom was found, like, you know, he jumped off a building, and the mom was found next to him crying, and apparently she was telling reporters, like, you know, all I was asking him was to always get 90 out of 100 minimum on his test. Like, is that too much to ask? You know? And it's just so sad hearing about that.
So actually, I don't think this is probably the only case. It's probably the only publicly reported case that we know. But there's no doubt that I think also in Singapore there's a certain fascination and interest, a very morbid one, but it is there, about what is the reasons behind teenage suicide. And there definitely in other societies, we know that where there is extensive studies, high academic pressure, especially living in a meritocratic society, those are very strong contributing factors into teenage suicide. I was just going to say this one thing also about education system, and that actually also dives in really well with this whole idea about, can we have a different environment where we don't use objective measures? So I haven't found this in Singapore to be the case, but definitely in many other countries, there are education systems where there are no grades, there are no tests being given. The philosopher, American philosopher John Dewey, so like in certain parts of America, there are schools that are set up after his kind of philosophical principles and pedagogy. And in those schools, right, students are actually openly cooperating with each other, not competing against each other when it comes to doing their homework or doing projects. The whole process is very explorative, so they're not like trying to drill down and do rote learning of facts and figures, but they're really out there trying to explore the world. And incidentally, I do think that give a more personal example, I think my niece and nephew actually had a chance to taste this a little bit in Australia. So when they were really young, they were in a school, well, my sister put them in a school because they were living in Australia at the time, where there was no emphasis on grades. Yeah, and it was, to what I've seen from them, a great shock to their system when they came back to Singapore. So actually the truth is there are alternative systems out there where we don't have to measure our kids, and they don't have to feel like their worth is measured by grades. Yeah, and because the question is for all of us is, do we want to live in a system like that? Yeah.
Well, the writers of this book, they have a whole chapter on education, and they actually had a suggestion for, so not about students but teachers. So in the US, they try to rank teachers according to how well, what percentage of the students do well in tests. There's different sorts of supposedly objective measurements. And what they recommend instead is that you have teachers write up reports of different things that they've tried with their students, and what worked and what didn't, and what were the results, if there was some interesting developments with the kids. And then they would send their report to, let's say, 5 other teachers around the country to review it. And then those teachers can then sort of write comments back, and they said what is good about this system is that then, each teacher is exposed to 5 different styles or methods of like other teachers, that they read, and they can, if just like the pick breeder program, they can select ones that seem interesting to them and then make variations on them, and so you'd have much more diversity of styles. So they actually think that would be a better system than trying to assess every teacher on the same objective measurement. Because in their view, having objective measures and having objectives that everyone is trying to converge on actually leads to a lot of uniformity and grayness.
Yeah, actually, maybe that is the problem at the heart of it, right? Which is, so even taking the school system or even in the corporate organization, there is a certain conformity that is actually deliberately produced and bred, and that is intentionally there, right? Because in order to get to the top, you need to fulfill certain criteria, and the criteria is really established and designed by people at the top. So it's already written, so to speak, right, from the principle of design that, hey, we want only certain types of people to be in the system. And so in that sense, actually people who don't conform or don't fit the rules, right, and the norms, they get filtered out. And so that's one way that we lose talent as well. Yeah, which is actually one of those things that is talked about in terms of meritocracy, which is we lose a lot of diversity because we only want certain types of people, and that is the problem with living in a meritocratic system. Yeah. Yeah.
So let's pivot towards Michael Sandel's book.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
do you have a definition of meritocracy that you can give viewers?
Yeah, so first thing to say, right, is that there's a very interesting history behind meritocracy because it's actually a word that was coined by a British sociologist, Michael Young, and it was intended to be a satire of the British educational system. In his satire, right, he actually wrote that the destructive or the negative element about living in a meritocracy is that successful people will only be self-congratulating themselves for their own efforts and abilities, and that what would then happen is that it would lead to this engagement of only certain types of people being in this social class, and leaving a lot of the people out, even though these other people are important contributors to to the system. So as he predicted, right, what would happen is that the people at the top, right, the winners, will then look at the losers in a very negative kind of way. So that is in principle how it started, and then what actually Michael Young is disappointed to see is that from something that was meant to be a negative term, it's now been transformed to something positive. So not just Singapore, but America, many other places, we now embrace the principle of meritocracy. So I think maybe it's more important for us to talk about, and then I'd like to hear your reactions first, right? Which is, why do people find this idea so appealing? And I think it goes down to one very simple example. And it's one that's even used by people who are critics of meritocracy. So if you're looking for a surgeon, right, and you got a very serious problem, you need someone to perform a surgery on you, obviously your first instinct is to go for, I want the best one out there, right? So in that sense, meritocracy is supposed to be that system where we want the best qualified person for the job, and no ifs and buts about it. And the other reason why I think meritocracy obviously has risen to become this new zeitgeist of the day, right, is because compared to previous systems where there was nepotism, there was genetic aristocracy, so being kings and rulers, right, and where there's a lot of, people have this image of like previous societies being very corrupt, people would generally just choose to give jobs to only people of their own family members. So compared to those previous systems of the past, meritocracy does look a lot better. And so even this recent book out there, written by this guy called Adrian Woodridge, called The Aristocracy of Talent. So he's writing this book to counter the various critiques of that meritocracy. Even he gives a certain left-wing critique of it, left-wing support of meritocracy, saying that if you look at feminists, even they asked for meritocracy because they were saying, please measure us on the same standards as men. And even for marginalized ethnic groups, they were also clamoring for the same thing as well. So I think in that sense, it is very hard to kind of dislodge and to think, well, if not meritocracy, then what? So I think that's the heart of it. That's why it's so hard to critique meritocracy. Yeah, because I think there's a certain intuitive appeal to it. Yeah. What do you think?
What was the guys who came up with meritocracy?
Michael Young.
Michael Young.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I like his idea of like the problem with that is the people who get to those positions, like they'll look down on the others. So yeah, Mingwei, I wanted to ask you, I mean, now that you've like fought so hard for this really competitive position, I mean, you beat so many other candidates to have the honor of breaking the spell. Do you find yourself like really looking down on all the other people that just couldn't cut it?
We had a very rigid objective test.
Well, that's the question, is like who sets the standards, who sets the parameters, right?
That's a very good question. I mean,
who gets to decide, and what are those measures and standards?
In this case, I think you were the one. You get to set the standards.
You set the standards.
Well,
yeah.
There's no other qualified.
There wasn't a lot of competition for the job.
I just wanted to say one thing, right? Before we continue deeper in this conversation, there's just been this very recent incident in Singapore where a driver driving a Bentley was trying to get into a school called Red Swastika School, and this person got into trouble because he allegedly cut the queue, and because he didn't want to obey the security guards who told him to back out, he actually aggressively continued to drive in, and hence he injured a security guard for that. And I think this is such a good, this timely event, right, really goes into the heart of what's wrong with a meritocratic system. Because the people at the top, the people who drive fancy cars, think they have all the say and all the, the freedom and the privilege to do as they please, and that there is nothing morally wrong that they're doing simply because of their social status in society. So anyway, so let's go back to Michael Sandel, and then we can talk a bit deeper about, I've just now articulated what was so appealing, right, about meritocracy. So where does Michael Sandel come in?
But
so,
before you do that, I just wanted to talk a bit about, you brought up the example of wanting to find the best surgeon, right?
Yeah, that's right.
An operation. And I think that's such a powerful point that, that just seems obvious that you want the best.
Yeah.
But I'm just recalling, so recently I actually attended a John Cleese show. He was in Singapore recently.
Oh,
and
man.
It was...
Bojo.
Actually, we were very lucky to get tickets. It was like last minute. We were sitting all the way at the back. I could hardly see him. And it wasn't like, it was actually, he gave a very philosophical talk. It wasn't like a stand-up comedy or anything. But one of the things he pointed out, which was quite funny, was if you look at the medical profession, the third most common cause of death after cancer and stroke or heart attacks is medical errors. And there's a lot of statistics or studies that show that, like, when, let's say, there's a cardiologist convention and all the doctors are there and not operating or whatever, life expectancy, like in hospitals, goes up. So I mean, it's just it seems that the data would suggest that the medical profession often does more harm than good. And so I think the question is, on an individual level, it might make sense to always want the best, but does this meritocratic system actually lead to the outcomes that you want? So maybe that's a question we can explore
this is a good one. Actually, maybe this reminds me of a point, and I'm not too sure whether this is the same thing that we're talking about, but in the book called Range, How Generalists Are Trumping Over Specialists, if that's the correct subtitle, written by David Epstein, I just can't remember the correct pronunciation of his surname right now, but he makes this point also about how due to the specialization of the medical profession, sometimes certain medical problems, going back to what I said about health just now actually, it gets very isolated, it gets diagnosed in a very isolated specialist kind of manner, and it then excludes all sorts of other variables, and that's where certain medical errors actually have been found. Certain high percentage of medical errors have been found. He makes a very interesting anecdotal point. It's a research study about something similar to that, where it's about when there were a group of cardiologists that were not in town or something like that, like the rate of heart disease went down, something like that. Yeah. So it was an interesting point. I should dig it up, but yeah, I think it goes into somewhat related to that. There's one other point I just want to make, just to be very fair to what's so appealing about meritocracy, which is, like I mentioned just now, this author Adrian Woodrid, he also actually mentioned Singapore, and he said, look, if you compare Singapore to Sri Lanka, that's his example, right, it shows that the more meritocratic a society is, the more prosperous it is. And I think definitely in a place like Singapore, we feel like we're living that kind of reality, that the more meritocratic our country is, the more economically prosperous that we are. Another friend of mine who recently had a very emotional experience dealing with, because he's a Malaysian citizen, dealing with the bureaucracy in Malaysia, like he was also telling me that, you guys don't appreciate Singapore enough, because the kind of corruption and issues that he faced in Malaysia, like you can't appreciate how difficult it is, whereas you in Singapore, you Singaporeans get to enjoy, a corrupt-free, society and a meritocratic society. So in that sense, I can understand why there's a certain degree of value in the idea about, hey, we want qualified people for the job. I think what is the problem, and now we can get into the issues of meritocracy. So we have three things to talk about. So let me talk about the first one first, and then let's banter a little bit. So the first thing is actually the principle of upbringing, and which is the idea about meritocracy, right? And this is such an important principle about it, is that we are supposed to start out all equal. We are supposed to be, if you imagine a finishing line, a race, we're supposed to be all equal to begin with. And so whoever finishes at the top, naturally, who wins the race, naturally must be the one that's more intelligent, stronger, fitter, whatever, right? I mean, think of all the different attributes to describe gifted, talented people. But here's the thing. For Michael Sandel, right, even when he looks at, say, college admissions to top universities in the US, what he finds is that empirically that's not the case, that usually it is the people who are coming from wealthier families, and the percentage is really high. We are talking about nearly 70% of the cohort coming from this kind of top 25% of the population, and only 3% of the school cohort coming from the bottom. Yeah, and he even says that the chance of entering Ivy League schools is 77% better for wealthier families, right? And this even despite very generous financial aid from poorer backgrounds. So I think at the end of the day, right, when we look at that metaphor just now that I described, we know empirically that's not true. We do not all start from the same base. So there is, no matter what in the real world, right, the element of upbringing, of where you come from, that has a lot to do with where you end up. And it gives you a lot more opportunities and resources and privilege to basically get quicker to the top. So I think that's really one problem with you're trying to say that we live in a meritocratic system, because we clearly don't. Yeah. So what do you think of that?
I mean, there's so many different issues now that, like, so many ways to carve up this topic. Like, it seemed earlier that you were opposing corruption with meritocracy.
Yeah.
Like those are two ends of the spectrum. The opposite of meritocracy is corruption, and vice versa, right? And so I'm wondering if that is really the case, or it's not so much about meritocracy is the opposite of corruption, as meritocracy is just a way of ranking things, or sorting people. But
I do think when it comes to the case of corruption, it's not as simple as to say that meritocracy is the antidote. I do think when it comes to corruption, there's so many social, cultural, political factors involved, and you could easily have, and in fact that's something that, actually I can bring up this point right now. So when you look at, say, Wall Street and what happened with the financial crisis, supposedly Wall Street is supposed to be a meritocratic system, but what happened was that the regulators, there was regulatory capture, the regulators didn't actually do a very good job on actually keeping the bankers, reining in the bankers who were taking very risky gambles with the financial products that they were utilizing. So there's an element of corruption in place, but it was kind of legal in that sense, because the regulators just weren't doing their jobs, right? And nevertheless, the bankers were obviously the cream of the crop. So I think at the end of the day, when it comes to stemming up corruption, it's more than just about meritocracy. I mean, you could still have very good, fine people at the top, but it doesn't change that there can be other measures or other things they can do to subvert the system and still be, doing things that actually are very socially destructive. Yeah. So I think it's not so simple to say, that meritocracy, like I said, is a solution. It's a one-stop cookie cutter solution.
I mean, so then the point about people starting at different starting points and getting an advantage. So that to me feels that meritocracy is about fairness. That's what we're concerned about, and that when we find out that meritocracy actually doesn't lead to fairness, then that's where we begin to question it, or don't feel so sure about it. Is that
So one of the reasons why Michael Sandel actually wrote the book on why he's so concerned with the topic is because he thinks that what we're experiencing right now with the populist uprisings, with Trump, all these things that are happening in America, but you could say largely happening around the world as well, with what you could describe as a certain right-wing authoritarianism spirit, is that people are rebelling against the system that they're supposed to believe in, right? So going back to what you say about fairness, right? So that is actually the second principle about meritocracy that Michael Sandel is critical of, which is, does it actually is meritocracy really fair? Because when those people rise to the top, what he calls the winners, right? Are they there because of their good fortune or because of their will and effort? So, so he uses a good philosophical thought experiment, right? So imagine if I had a chance to be brought up being drilled in soccer. Maybe my dad wants me to be a great soccer player, right? So, it wouldn't change even if I become one of the greatest soccer players in Singapore, for example. I would never be like Ronaldo. Or there may be certain structural disadvantages like, my height or my build. So the way Michael Sandel designs this thought experiment for us to reflect on is that even despite our best gifts, there's always going to be someone out there better than you. So that's already one. So no matter how much effort you got, there's certain structural disadvantages that you have as an individual. So that's really one thing. And then of course, like we said about your Steven Spielberg example, well, maybe you would never get a chance to be Steven Spielberg because you're not going to be given access to Hollywood producers and you don't have the right connections. I like this example, which has always stuck in my head since I was in university. In one of my lectures, my lecturer, my professor, showed this really old social hierarchy chart. And it showed that, we're talking about really like 100 years ago, and it showed actors and artisans as the bottom of the hierarchy. But look at how different that is right now, how much we've inverted that. Now, actors are paid millions of dollars, whereas a few hundred years ago, they would have been laughed at, they would have been mocked, they would have been considered the trash of society. So, obviously things have changed so much, and who you are right now about, whether your talents are socially valued is really contingent on the era and the society that you belong to. If you are a great actor in America, sure, you can be earning millions. Great in America, in some poor country, in some developing country, maybe not so great. So that's why it goes back to what you say about fairness. Is it really fair when a lot of a lot of the talents that we value is pretty much socially arbitrary? Yeah.
So I'm thinking now of like two dimensions to meritocracy. One is the sorting aspect, the aspect of it which sorts people into categories or on points on the spectrum. And then there's the other part of it which allocates resources, society's resources, the goods of society, to those people depending on how they're categorized. And so I'm wondering, is the problem not so much in the fact that we sort people? Because for instance, I can definitely say that you are better physical, gym trainer than I am. Like
Sure.
You are training me. Like,
Sure.
like there's no debate about that.
Sure.
We are unequal in our expertise. Similarly, Mingwei is a much more proficient camera person than you are.
Definitely.
No debate
Yeah,
about
yeah,
that. So it's not so much the sorting part that we have a problem with. It's the fact that like we seem to have a system where we allocate society's resources to a certain group of people just based on that allocation. So maybe if we lived in I don't want to use the word communism because communism has a bad term, but if we lived in a society where
It's more egalitarian.
Everyone still had all the resources they needed to live a flourishing life. Maybe then we wouldn't be so bothered that people were being sorted according to.
So I think what you bring up is okay. We obviously don't want to live in a society where some high authority figure is going to decide for you what you're going to do in life. Obviously, we don't want that, right? You should have the freedom to decide what you want to do in life. The problem we have right now is that, and this goes also into one of the best critiques I have about, we have about meritocracy, which is certain kind of jobs confer better benefits than others. So what I have in my notes today also is that take a look at, when we say we go to university, right? So now, especially in the meritocratic system, one of the most important things to have is credentials, right? So Michael Sandel says that the more credentials you have, the more you have under your belt, the better person that you are, the more worth you have, the more resources you're supposed to ask for, right? But take a very simple fact that when someone graduates from university, the business graduate starts with a much higher starting salary than someone that comes from a nursing background, someone from a social work background. But we know that the person who's in the who's working in the business sector, right? And this is even something that's agreed upon by, in Singapore locally, we have the esteemed professor, Tommy Koh, who agreed that a fund manager is not contributing socially constructive goods as compared to the nurse, but yet the fund manager is paid a lot more compared to a nurse. So in terms of like what you're asking, the question that you're begging, right? That's why Michael Sandel suggests that, you know, we can't tell people obviously where they should be sorted to. We can't sort people, right? But what we can do is to aim for a much more redistributive form of justice. And in that sense, that's why one of the very specific proposals he had in mind, because he was asked about this in a debate, in a lecture, you know, if you are president, what is one policy proposal you would have, or policy form implementation you would have? And he said he would never tax a laborer more than a person earning his income from capital gains or estate duty, you know. So the idea is that we should value work, you know, we should give a certain dignity to work, and we need to actualize that, right? To show, to, you know, to make it very, very salient to everyone that there's a certain kind of work that we value, and we need to, you know, whether it's increasing their wages, whether it's providing a lot more social benefits, we need to make sure that people who work in blue-collar jobs in particular, there is a key concern, are given a much more dignified life. Yeah, and I think that's a great idea. I think that's, you know, one way we can go around it. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it feels like for Sandel, meritocracy today has a specific color and flavor.
Yeah.
It's a value system which tends to favor white-collar work over blue-collar work. It's a system that rewards people who already have money and resources compared to those who don't. So I'm wondering if there's a way to save meritocracy if you said, okay, like let's just have a different value system. What if it was still a meritocracy, but this time we value physical labor more or equally? You know, do you feel that would save meritocracy?
Yeah,
or?
so this is interesting actually, because for that, right, so besides Michael Sandel, I also was reading the economist Donald Low, and Donald Low has this interesting essay called Good Meritocracy versus Bad Meritocracy, and of course he was talking about Singapore in this case. So essentially the way Donald Low writes about it is that the problem with Singapore is that the kind of dimensions of meritocracy, and he has 4 dimensions, maybe I won't be able to go through all of it, but they are very warped. So to give you an example, so he says that in Singapore, for example, the way that we rank people is through a relative dimension. So he uses a simple example of like doing the IPPT test, right? The what is it called? Individual Physical Proficiency Test, right? So it's a physical test for men. So imagine, right? So right now with the way that you do your IPPT test, it's just based on your own performance, right? So it doesn't matter if, let's say, we're both in the same round. If I do more push-ups than you, right? It's not going to affect the kind of rewards that you get, right? Your grade is based on your performance alone. But the problem is that under the meritocratic system that we have right now, it's very relative. So if you and I are working in the same office, if I do more work than you, if I have more credentials than you, then naturally I'm going to get more bonus than you, right? And that he thinks is problematic. It also means that under such a system, so like I said, imagine 2 of us working in the same office, we're going to spend a lot of resources, waste a lot of resources, just competing against each other, right? For that one, what he calls positional good, right? Because only one of us can be number 1 or get that top A grade, right? And in so doing, it reduces our social trust, it reduces our cooperation with each other, right? And in that sense, you know, it's going to breed that kind of competitiveness, mistrust, selfishness, you know, things that may not be objectively good for the company as a whole. And of course, at the same time, the idea is that, like, do we need to function like this? The company doesn't have to give me more bonus than you do, right? Bring back what you said just now about objective measures. Maybe the company could look at your strengths in different ways and not feel that you have to be, you have to suffer a loss of certain goods on salary just because you're not as good as me on certain other dimensions. Yeah. So that's one way that we can kind of look at it, where you can save meritocracy, but you look at all the different dimensions of it. And the other one that I do like that he talks about also is type versus effort. So what Donald refers, what he means by that is that, so going back to the same example that we have about me and you working in the same company, the truth is that maybe the company is not going to measure our performance based on our effort, because maybe I'm going to put in less effort than you, but maybe I'm a certain type of person, maybe I have certain attributes that they like, and maybe there's certain advantages I have. Maybe my father happens to know the CEO of the company, maybe I have certain connections, so there are all these little things, right? All these certain attributes or traits. Maybe I'm more aggressive than you, and so that's why I go up to the top. So going back to what you said just now about principle of fairness, maybe that's not fair for me to be, going up faster than you or being rewarded more than you just because of the certain types of stuff, certain types of things that I possess, versus actually maybe you put in a lot of effort, but all of that is just not recognized. So there are ways to kind of reform meritocracy, and I think it goes back to like what I said, that maybe we can't help but live in a society where on some fundamental level, of course, we want someone qualified and credentialed, as you said, someone that's skilled for the job, but we don't have to measure people with very arbitrary tools or constructs.
Yeah, I mean, so here's a thought experiment. Like what if we were to redesign our society and have a meritocracy based on kindness, so that like we reward the people who are the most kind. And I think we can all agree kindness is a great attribute. Like, yeah, that makes so much more sense. But I think even there, we will still have the problems of how do you measure kindness? Different people will have different sort of ways of measuring it. And this goes back to Ming-Wei's question earlier. Who decides what the benchmarks for kindness are, So I feel there's a fundamental problem with trying to have some kind of objective measurement that we are trying to value and sort people in.
I mean, that's tough, man, because you're asking now for a measurement of, and just to contrast this, right? Okay, let's take your idea seriously, right? Let's try and measure people's level of kindness. Consider what's happening in China right now. They have a social credit rating system where you're familiar with what I'm talking about, right? Where individuals are being spied upon. The more good deeds that you do in public, so maybe if you help an elderly person cross the road, maybe if you give more donations, then you go up the social credit scale. But there's certain pervasiveness, there's something just really, ugly about this, because we can question whether are these individuals sincerely, authentically performing these public deeds of the kindness of their heart, or are they doing it because they want to get a certain ranking, right? And what's worse is that in a system like that, there are certain rewards that you get by going up the scale, because I could be wrong about this, but supposedly this system was intentionally designed because people who were considered publicly disobedient or rude, they would be ranked low on the measurement, and so they wouldn't be allowed to travel. Apparently, that's one of the reasons why China designed that system. So, I think it's a tough question. I think that from what I can at least offer for now, is that the way that we have as a system right now in terms of this meritocratic system is that it's like we have these very abstract principles, but the abstract principles don't run very well in the real world, because in the real world, when someone has a lot of credentials, someone is high up on the social hierarchy, she naturally receives a lot of resources and goods, and that confers a lot of power, and that is the problem. So we need to have a different political, economic system where these people still have their place in society. There's no doubt I still want experts. There's no doubt that certain people may be good leaders, for example, but they should have their, for lack of a better word, their power levels stymied to a certain level. Like they need to, as Ming-Wei puts it, there needs to be a certain extra layer of vigilance, surveillance, and monitoring, right? So it is a hard question, because the truth is that the only people who are qualified to do this should be the public, should be the community. To offer this very interesting proposal that was brought up in a Michael Sandel lecture, one contributor suggested a sort of sortition system. So we don't have this in Singapore, but in America, for example, the jury in their courts are decided by a random sample of their peers. So we don't have that here in Singapore, but you can imagine that you can take this form of system and implement it into legislature, parliaments, systems of governance, where there is a selected group of the community who will be allowed to arbitrate and to monitor and just make demands of the people at the top. Yeah, and I think that would be one way we can go around that problem.
Yeah, I mean, so a thought that came up for me is I still feel that there's something fundamentally mysterious about reality.
Yeah.
That we're always on the edge of. So I feel like the whole system of meritocracy came out of the Industrial Revolution, where you really needed to have the most efficient workers and whatever, and that came out of classical Newtonian physics. Now, if you look at physics today, quantum physics, the picture of reality is so different. I mean, Newtonian physics, people felt you could mathematically sort of measure everything and predict, the movements of objects. In quantum physics, there's a fundamental what they call indeterminacy of nature, which means at some fundamental level you cannot measure nature. With particles, the more you try and measure the position, the velocity is very fuzzy. But if you try and measure the velocity and you can pinpoint it, the position is very fuzzy. You can't get a lock on both. And so I feel there's a certain parallel to what we're attempting to do in society and meritocracy, that we're trying to measure things, to control it, to know where things are. But the more we try and do it, the uncertainty will just pop up somewhere else. So, for instance, China's attempts to measure kindness, right? They will probably only succeed actually in measuring the people who can fool the system the best.
Right.
That's what you're really measuring, right? So what you think you're measuring is not what you're really measuring. And I think that's the weakness of any kind of meritocracy system, because it's based on measurement. If it's based on measurement, and maybe an alternative, if we wanted to redesign meritocracy, is that it's not based on measurement but more on relationships. And this is where I can bring in the point that I think Santosh wanted us to bring up in this conversation, right, where he said, in nature, it's not so much about the organism that can outcompete all the others and is the fittest, for survival. It's more the entire ecosystem that supports that organism to thrive. So if we had a meritocratic system that focused more on the relationships between people, and maybe that's similar to your point earlier about having groups of people that are empowered to question those who are governing, right? Where you're distributing the centers of power so that it's not so concentrated. So maybe that's a hint of where a new design for meritocracy can come from.
Yeah, so I think the way Santosh also discussed this point, right, actually it really goes very well with the conclusion of Michael Sandel's book, because there are kind of a few principles you can think of. There's a principle of equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, and the third one, which very few people talk about, equality of condition. So obviously in this case, that it would mean that we look at the environment, we look at the social conditions and the ecosystem, and we actually ask the question, is that environment conducive, optimal? Well, that sounds very like it's very badgering already, but you get the point, which is you actually fundamentally assess, whether it is breeding a good environment for human beings, for nature. Let me just read out a little bit from the book, so that way we can then deconstruct and talk a little bit more about where we are going right now in trying to address meritocracy for short. Okay, so he ends it like this. Usually when we discuss about redistributive justice, there are two strategies or endpoints: equality of opportunity, which is about leveling the playing field or equality of results, which is about making sure everyone gets the same rewards, right? Sorry, that's my notes. Let me quote correctly from him right now. Okay, so what he says actually, equality of opportunity is a morally necessary corrective to injustice, but it's a remedial principle, so it's not adequate ideal for a good society. It's not easy to keep up with this distinction because we are inspired by the heroic rise of a few. We ask how others might be enabled to escape the conditions that weigh them down. But rather than repair the conditions that people want to flee, we construct a politics that makes mobility the answer to inequality. And breaking down barriers is a good thing. No one should be held back by poverty or prejudice. But a good society cannot be premised only as the promise of escape. And so it's often assumed that the only alternative to equality of opportunity is a sterile, oppressive equality of results. But there is another alternative, a broad equality of conditions that enable those who do not achieve great wealth or prestigious positions to live lives of decency and dignity, exercising the abilities in work that wins social esteem, sharing the widely diffused culture of learning, deliberating with their fellow citizens about public affairs. So I'm going to stop here. So I think this is, the issue at hand, which is going back to a really real example, right? So someone who is wealthy and affluent, right, they do not have to mix with someone who is poor. And I actually can give very personal examples of this, where I've met people who have never had to see a HDB house, who have never had to go to a coffee shop. They don't even want to step into those spaces. Yeah. And so they are totally ignorant about how people who live in, say, 3-room HDBs, people who go to the public kindergarten school, who go to neighborhood schools, how they don't have access to the same resources as someone who's affluent, who can afford, say, 101 enrichment classes for their child, who's able to sponsor, family holidays and stuff like that. I mean, they get so much more good quality of life, and that we can measure, as compared to someone who doesn't. So, so going back to what we were talking about, ecosystems and stuff like that. So, in that sense, if we want to address meritocracy, right? The pitfalls of it. We shouldn't just, which is very, very prevalent in our current discourse, which is everyone more or less says we need to increase equality of opportunity. So the person who's poor should be given a chance to have tuition or something like that, right? But we know that that's not enough because the conditions where they live in is just not the same. If they have an abusive household, if they have, they live under neighborhoods that are poor quality, right? It's just not the same as someone who lives under better conditions. And that is then a public project that we have to be serious about. Yeah.
Sorry, I think I got distracted a little bit, so I wasn't really following the last bit that you're saying, but I did want to ask Mingwei a question. Now that you've listened to both of us, who do you think is the best speaker?
Neither of you.
No, you have to pick one. That is, you have to. This is the meritocratic system. There has to be a best.
Someone must be great.
Yeah, there must be. So you have to pick one of us.
Yeah, that's a hard question, isn't it? I mean, it's. I think it should be measured. The conversation should be measured. Not how both of you contribute to the conversation. Not individually. Yeah, I like that. I like the notion of thinking about how a community can act together to raise the circumstances of people who are, quote unquote, behind, so.
You haven't paid him, man. That's why. Because you haven't paid him, that's why he's not calling you out.
Yeah. Well, that was a very diplomatic answer. But
let me just add one more point, by the way, just to talk about this idea about dignity of work, right? Because I think there's also, among us, we want to respect, obviously, the people who have been so important, shown to be very important, especially during the pandemic. So whether it's the delivery workers, the nurses, the people who clean our streets, the garbage collectors, right? I mean, Michael Sandel talks a lot about how we need to ensure we have a social responsibility to confer certain dignity of work with what they do. And I want to relate a very personal example. I have someone who's a nurse, or who's a friend who is a nurse, and there is a lot of cynicism about how we try to acknowledge their contribution. So whether it is with the public clapping, with the government-sponsored congratulatory messages on TV, I mean, these things are really, sincerely speaking, coming from them as workers, they don't like it because they just feel it's cheap. It does not really accord, real serious respect and honor to, their contributions, and it's very, very symbolic. So, if we want to be serious about ensuring that they live a life of dignity, it does entail a change in their material conditions. So whether they have better pay, whether, for example, talking about going up the ladder if they have the right credentials, can the nurse become the CEO? Of course not, right? We know that's not going to happen, but the nurse is always going to be perceived as the bottom of the tier. And so we need to make sure that we want to give these people a serious opportunity, to rise up, to come out of their, to come out of where they are, the rut that they're in, right? And that, does not have to be from individual effort. That has to be socially contributed by, the government and people like us. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I was being a little cheeky earlier, but I actually wanted to bring out what I feel is another problematic feature of meritocracy today, is that it introduces artificial scarcity. So just, let's say, forcing someone to pick who is the best between us, right? There can only be one best.
Yep.
So that introduces scarcity. And one of my favorite examples of illustrating this is the game of musical chairs, where you get people to go around, and when the music stops, you remove one chair, and then everyone has to scramble to find a seat. And the person who can't find a seat, they have to leave the game, right? And so the system forces some people to be winners and some to be losers. And, to me, that's the meritocratic system. Someone hasn't found a chair, and then there's so many theories about why that's the case. They didn't work hard enough, they're not smart enough, they didn't have the right values, they didn't come from the right culture, but the reality is that they didn't find a chair because the system was designed to introduce artificial scarcity. So what if we had a different system where it wasn't about removing a chair, it's about there's a variety of different chairs, and there's enough chairs for everyone, and the game is who can find the most appropriate chair for them that fits their body, that they like, it's a nice color, and that's the game, right? Everyone just finds the chair that's most suited to them. So to me, that's a much better vision of society that, I think we should be aiming for. And I don't know, when you bring up the example of could a nurse be a CEO, I am wondering, do you even think if society would be better than the system we have today if things were decided by random lottery?
Right.
So that every now and then, there's a lottery system, and whoa, okay, all of a sudden this nurse is now the CEO. I mean, it sounds crazy, but I know there's a part of me that thinks maybe would actually be a better system.
Actually, there is this is the first time I'm bringing it up, but there is a interesting economic school of thought called participatory economics. So it's developed by these two political economists, Robin Hennell and Michael Albert. And in their design of participatory economics, what they call Paracon for short, they suggest this allocation of roles, lottery of roles, where people do actually change roles according to a certain schedule. So everyone is given a chance to manage, to work, and also, more importantly, to ensure that any onerous work is evenly split and distributed among all members of that community. So it's not that far-fetched. It's just a matter of whether we want to,
if tomorrow there's any chance at all that the lottery would decide that I am going to be a garbage collector, then it would be in my best interest to make sure that the job of a garbage collector is actually dignifying, right? That if I had to wake up tomorrow morning and I'm a garbage collector, I'm like, okay, I mean, not the thing I wanted to do today, but I can live with it,
Yeah, so I think this is why it's so hard to criticize meritocracy to then opt for this alternate system, because the people at the top will find this idea particularly hideous. They will not want to imagine themselves, being allocated to other smaller roles, and they would imagine it's a great waste of their time and their talent. And that is, like a certain social attitude, a problematic social attitude that we have to confront. Yeah, and I think it's more like, in order to go for this alternative system, we all have to, incidentally, that is the subtitle of the book, Michael J. Sandel's book, What's Become of the Common Good. This is such an important key word that we should have in our heads. What is the common good with having a meritocratic system where we are selfish, egoistic, only looking out for ourselves, versus an alternative system where we actually are looking out for each other? And as you said, if you one day you have to be the garbage collector, or everyone has to be a garbage collector for 2 days of the year or 3 days of the year, then we all want to do our part to make sure that the system of collecting garbage is efficient, that it's clean, that people don't have to suffer injuries, that it's safe. Yeah, you would do everything that you can to make sure that the people who have, everyone has to have a very dignified, as a dignified work. Yeah,
I mean, just as an example from Burning Man culture, like I've been to, different Burning Man events, and they're all volunteer run. And I went to one in Spain called Nowhere, and they had actually the most beautiful outdoor toilets. They were compost toilets, and they were all at the periphery of the event, facing out. So as you're doing your morning shit, you get to enjoy the beautiful scenery. And it's done in such a way that no one can see, so you actually have privacy. But they actually have volunteers that have to clean the compost toilets and make sure they're clean and everything. And they were called potty ninjas, I think. Right. And yeah, there was dignity to that role as well. And people would write appreciations to their potty ninja and say, thanks for keeping this clean.
Right.
And, at the end of the day, we have to accept that in society, there are going to be unpleasant jobs that people have to do. But I think we could do a much better job of making those jobs at least enjoyable and appreciated.
Essentially, there's something to be said about the argument that the reason why these jobs continue to be so degrading is because there's not enough capital put into trying to revolutionize and make these jobs even more, cleaner, more dignified, because there's no money in it. But that also goes back to the idea about meritocracy and capitalism, because there's no money, there's no profits to be made from it, and who cares about the people who do such ugly jobs? That's why we don't do anything for them. So it's a very sad state of affairs because of the economic systems or the economic mindset that we live under. Anyway, I actually just want to say one last thing, because we've talked for quite long, which is, there was something you mentioned just now, and it relates to equality of results, right? Because I think that's what scares a lot of people as well, because they're like, well, if I put in X plus effort more than you do, why should you have the same results as I do, right? And that's a lot of, again, I think it goes back to very natural, instinctual reactions to why people want meritocracy, because they believe that, hey, I put in a lot more effort, why should you still deserve the same rewards as I do? And I think going back to the idea about realisticness of the system that we have, I think, of course, we all can live in the same house or have the same income. I'm also very much in favor that, sure, I want doctors to be well paid, but at the same time, I want nurses to be well paid as well. So I think it's really more about like ensuring that we now, and it goes back actually, ironically, to objective measures or standard measurements. We can measure inequality. We can measure, for example, I have right now data that the ratio of CEO pay to workers has increased astronomically from 264 to 299, and this after 10 years. It rose about 940%, the gap from 1978, which Fortune magazine even called obscene in a 2016 article, and they even acknowledged that this rise of CEO pay is not due to firm performance, right? And we also have seen in the pandemic that billionaires are only getting richer, whereas the workers are not. So I think at the end of the day, we need to, going back to what we said about public good, redistributive justice, right, dignified work, there is a strong argument hence to be made that the best thing, as I said just now, that we can do is that although we can't make sure everyone earns the same income, but we can make sure it's not so disparate. I mean, there's no reason why the CEO should be paid 900 times more, than the worker. I mean, or look at Elon Musk, where a lot of the wealth that he generates is not through actual work and effort, but really through stocks and the rise of the stock value. So again, I think we now live in an age where people are very receptive to these ideas, and it's just a matter of recognizing there's a certain public good to ensuring this that we live in a much more egalitarian and equal society. Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the only reason why CEOs are paid so much, more than, let's say, workers is that they have greater bargaining power.
Right.
That, it's not that they're more valuable to society.
Yep.
And so I think at the root of this, like, we've known about this inequality for a while. As you say, we can measure it, but despite that, nothing is being done, and that's because the power structures remain unquestioned. And I think one of the things that really stops people from really being able to question and chip away at these power structures is this idea of meritocracy, and so I think that's why I was interested in this topic. Like, that's an important spell that we need to break. I mean, there are many, many others in order to really try and shift power, but I think this is one of the big ones. It's like, it is a myth. It's a myth that preserves the current power structures.
Speaking of arbitrary of measurement, right? Think about what we talk about in our degrowth video. I mean, we measure, how much money people are making. We measure GDP. But those are not true indicators of societal well-being, right? As we talk about in that video, and we are not even measuring the right things: environmental well-being, ecological health, people's quality of life. Yeah, we're just not measuring the right things too. So, that is another problem.
Anyway, this is why, like, I'm not bothering to measure our viewership or subscribers. It's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. We are still great.
Yeah. Coming from Santosh himself, he says that compared to a video that talks about, cosmetics or petty politics or whatever that gets, 11,000 views, I mean, they don't have any transformative value, whereas he thinks we do. So let's hope we're doing our part to meet up to that kind of standards, transforming people's lives. Yeah.
Okay, well, this has been great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mingwei, for your contributions.
My pleasure.
Any last comments?
No, it's been a great conversation as always.
Okay.
Okay.